Welcome to the information processing seminar. I'll start by acknowledging that this meeting is taking place on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who, and I will also pay respects to their elders, past and present. And I will pass over now to Manikya. Take it away.
Hey, it's nice to finally be giving a talk here. For those that don't know me, I'm Manikya, and I've been kind of coming in and out of this information processing group stuff. But I generally work with sort of Andy Purforce and Keith Ransom. That's sort of what the bulk of my PhD topic is about. But I'm also working on this stuff, so it's nice to be able to give a talk here, because this part of my PhD work is much more relevant to you guys. Sometimes I present this to sort of the people who are doing like higher order learning and reasoning stuff, and their eyes glaze over. So it'll be nice to present this to people who might have a better understanding. A few caveats though, when I agreed to give this talk like 2 to 3 months ago, as it always is the case, I assumed I would have plenty of time to do this and run many more results. But the good thing is that this like deadline made me do a lot of work, but the bad news is it was pretty much all in the last week. So a lot of these results I haven't had time. This is still very much in the early development phase. It's very much just an idea that we've done a little bit of empirical testing on, developed a whole bunch of models, but it's pretty rough, and I haven't had time to dig into a lot of the results we want to. Also caveat, it's going to be pretty diffusion modeling heavy, and I haven't described the diffusion model a whole lot. So if you're not familiar with the diffusion model, this might be tricky to talk. But the context of the talk is that psychological constructs are dynamic, right? So as we spend time on a task, our psychological states and our cognitive capacities change, right? And this doesn't even have to be an experiment where you're deliberately trying to manipulate these things. People just learn or become habituated or get bored as a function of the time that they're spending on the task. But a lot of approaches that attempt to model constructs, these kinds of constructs, don't make this assumption. So they assume that you can sort of estimate a single parameter that describes the state of someone across the whole experiment. And evidence accumulation models are typical examples of this, right? So they tend to give us a single estimate of cognitive constructs for the whole experiment. And so things like information processing efficiency, drift rate, bias, which is starting point, and caution, which is threshold. And there's good reasons for this, right? Like, we do this because it improves the reliability of estimates. We need to do a whole lot of trials and basically get people to repeat the exact same thing a bunch of times, because we need to get some sort of reliable parameter estimation. So I'm definitely not saying that this isn't the way it should be done, but it is unlikely that these things are actually constant across time, right? And so there's been previous work that's sort of attempted to tackle this problem in some way, right? So for example, there's been a lot of work looking at practice functions with response times. So a large body of previous work seems to suggest that response times conform. You'll see a lot of typos like this, I think, during the talk. Conform to mathematical functions during practice, right? So originally they described it as sort of like a power law of practice, where as you've got more practice on a task, response times would gradually increase as you sort of got more proficient, and that shape tended to follow a power function. More recently, people have said that it resembles a bit more of an exponential function, and then more recently still, there's been these transition functions that have emerged that seem to do an even better job of accounting for this trend. But the point is, the good thing about this sort of method is that you get quite fine-grained estimates, or trial level estimates of how people's performance change over time. But a limitation of this particular way of doing things is that it's only in terms of response time, right? So the parameters of the functions that you're modeling don't have clear psychological meanings, unlike those of diffusion model parameters. Another approach that's been taken in the past is simply just to estimate a different value of the parameter in each block, right? So looking at block level changes. for example, Dutil and colleagues showed that estimates of all of the diffusion model parameters on the right, I've only got threshold and drift rate, but they pretty much showed that all of the diffusion model parameters seem to vary across blocks in their paradigm. But of course, they're not actually modeling anything systematic here. They're just estimating a different value in each block. And oh yeah.
Are these always within like a single session?
I think so.
Okay, so this is
Yeah.
like
At least
like
these
a
ones.
one session shot. You get BRTs and they change from the beginning to the end.
Yeah,
of the session.
yeah.
Okay.
That's what at least really haven't looked in detail enough at all the previous literature to see if other people don't do it that way. But the context of this talk is we're talking about like single session data.
Okay.
But I think it could generalize to things that are outside the session, but you might need some other.
Yeah, I was just
This-
thinking like one of, when we look at collecting lots of RTs, one of the things we'll do is collect a session and then not analyze it just because of this issue. Because
Right.
we want to look at asymptotic performance. So
Yeah.
we'll only analyze like the later sessions where
Yeah.
performance is kind of stabilized.
Well, great, because I got a model for you. Yeah, no, so that's, yeah, we'll get to that, but that's kind of what we're trying to show to do in this project.
Cool.
So this is the same sort of thing. In Evans et al, they just estimate a different threshold parameter each block. After the fourth block, they in one of the conditions they provided feedback, and you can see in that bottom plot on the side there that that sort of after you receive that feedback, the threshold sort of drops dramatically, and they were able to sort of capture that with these block level changes. But of course, the positive of this is that you do get estimates of how cognitive constructs change over time. So that's sort of plus over the pure law of practice stuff or practice response time modeling. But the limitation is it's not particularly fine grained, right? As the focus is just on the block level, and you completely miss any learning that happens within blocks, such as the start of the experiment. It's not particularly theoretically motivated either. You're just sort of letting things vary across blocks. And then some more previous work again is some much more recent work. I haven't actually cited the study here, but I'm talking about a particular study by, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Gunawan, and I think Andrew Heathcote was involved in this as well. People at Wollongong and New South Wales. So this kind of model, in this kind of model, they're able to show that people switch between different types of psychological states across time. So they identified two states that people kind of transition between in this paradigm. One was a more cautious state and one was a more urgent state. And these different states mapped onto sort of differences in threshold across time in the LBA. And they found that a model assuming trial level state switching outperformed models that assume block level state switching. So the good thing about this is that this method is you get estimates of different states that people may be in on different trials, but the limitation is that it doesn't really tell us about learning or other sort of more systematic sort of time-dependent dynamics. And people can sort of swap back and forth whenever, right? There's no sort of theory about you can't really integrate a theory of how people's states might systematically change across time.
What's the task here? Is it lexical decision or something like
I think it's lexical decision making, yeah. Okay. But yeah, I can't remember exactly. Yeah, it would be lexical decision making and then they did a few different tasks, but I think this one is lexical decision making. And another previous perspective again have just sort of emerged in the last 5 years or so is in sort of combining reinforcement learning models with diffusion models or integrating diffusion model parameters into reinforcement learning. And so, for example, Pedersen and colleagues, they developed an RL plus diffusion model where threshold and drift rate could sort of be constrained by power functions across time or scaled by power functions across time. And I think this is a really interesting approach because it's sort of, you get these fine-grained estimates of learning in cognitive constructs, and you also get this sort of theoretical, you can sort of theoretically motivate these changes well by making it follow a specific function, which obviously was missing in some other previous approaches. But the limitation here is that you do need some sort of some aspect of the stimulus to constrain the parameter changes. So basically, in simple terms, that means you need an RL paradigm of some variety to be able to model this. So some sort of reinforcement learning paradigm. And then I think this is the last previous work that I'm going to talk about. And this is, again, also really recent stuff. Has a very fancy name, neural superstatistic estimation. I think that's just cut off. And it's basically a deep learning method for estimating trial by trial variation in model parameters. And this is more of an estimation technique that you can sort of apply to whatever model you're interested in, but they do try to apply this to the diffusion model. And the good thing about this, this technique, I probably don't really understand it as well as I should, but the positive is that you get fine-grained estimates of learning where you don't need to constrain the model according to stimulus, right? So it avoids the pitfalls of reinforcement learning, is it's quite general to the task that you're using. But the pretty big limitation, particularly because they coined this as like an estimation technique, is that there isn't enough constraint, right? There's no theoretical constraint, and all that with this sort of means that these changes don't seem to be well identified. So you can see in the plot below, this is in their own paper, that they don't really acknowledge that there's quite a lot of error between the generated parameter and the estimated parameters. So you would expect quite a lot of fluctuation across trials, even without there being fluctuation across trials, right? Because the error in the recovery is quite large.
So sorry, really quick on that. So how does that work? So I know they've done some work on estimating parameters using convolutional neural nets. Is that the idea that you could just kind of, after you get a set of parameters, you could just like subject a single trial to the deep learning model and it will give you an estimate of what the parameters are?
That's my understanding, but I don't know enough about these models to know precisely how it's done.
Yeah, right.
But I just, yeah, I can, from what I can tell though, it just doesn't seem to be particularly reliable as an estimation technique, at least for the diffusion model.
Yeah,
it
right.
seems like they have some sort of hierarchical thing where they've got, yeah, they do sort of, I guess, they train this neural net on sort of the group level parameters, and then they can use that to sort of constrain
right.
stuff. But yeah, yeah, it's definitely not my area. So in our study here, we're trying to introduce a more general framework for modeling diffusion model parameters as trial varying mathematical functions. So I'll get much more into detail about what this looks like in a second, but again, we're very much in the development stages, and I think there's still a lot to be said about what these models can actually be used for. So we've started with kind of tentative research questions or tentative goals, right? So the first thing that we're looking at least at this stage, is are these models that predict systematic changes in parameters better than the standard model, at least from a model comparison perspective? And if so, does it look like multiple parameters are varying across time, or is it usually just one parameter that's driving these systematic changes? Of course, that's always going to depend on the task, and we're just testing it on one task here, but I guess we're just trying to look at the model's capacity to distinguish these things. And then the third thing we're looking at is, are these changes trial dependent or block dependent? And fourth, do time varying processes affect the measurement properties of the standard diffusion model? And I'll get into all of these as we go. So the basic idea is that the standard diffusion model, in the standard diffusion model, we can think of parameters as a constant value across time. So A is just A, and it's the same for all trials. But what if instead we conceptualize threshold, for example, in this example, to increase linear as people become more confident in the task, right? I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption that you can make in pretty much any multi-trial experiment, that in a lot of cases, actually that should say threshold should decrease. But yeah, threshold should decrease linearly as people become more confident in the task. And actually this is all messed up because that should be a negative B. But anyway, just humor me for a second, you'll see the more exact equations soon. But what you can see here is that you can actually model the parameters as their own functions, right? And so instead of estimating A, you're estimating like say for example, a beta and a intercept or something like that.
Depends a lot on the task where you're doing this exact same thing every trial, because you get strong sequential effects when you change the difficulty of the stimulus, or you have relationship between the stimuli from trial to
Like
trial.
what the function would be, you mean?
Yeah, like in categorization, we've shown that if
Yeah.
the similarity of the preceding trial has a huge influence on the response times and accuracy of the following trial.
So, like, absolutely. I think so. The purpose of this, as I think I sort of tried to say in the research questions part, is we're not trying to find what function best describes response time models, because obviously that's going to be completely different depending on what task you have. Although there is probably something in this, I want to apply it to many more data sets and see if we can find some sort of more general functions, but
like I can imagine you're right. Like the as people become more confident, their threshold decreases across trials.
Yeah.
But that's going to be independent of other stimulus specific effects that might be going on.
I guess, yeah, but in that experiment is would threshold be something that you're interested in anyway? Like, you definitely would have other stimulus specific effects, but I guess the point is if you think, and this is just an example of an assumption, and I think that it's reasonable to say that lots of tasks, and particularly the tasks that we're using here, right? Definitely threshold reduces across time. But yeah.
I think maybe you'll get to this. Sorry, I know we're interjecting a lot, but would you necessarily guarantee that it would decrease, or would it might increase? Would it more instead kind of approach some optimal threshold?
Yeah, so like an asymptote, for example, right?
Or just that, like, for instance, that you can calculate the optimal threshold in the diffusion model, and so somebody could start low and go up to it, or start high and go down to it, right?
Yeah,
like something based on.
You definitely could, and I think the point is that you could, with this general framework, right? You could encode whatever assumption you want, is so long as you have a function you think describes it. And this is just an example, and this isn't like a fast thing that says that like in every task, like threshold decreases. But as an example, I think it's reasonable to say that often people become less cautious, they get better. Certainly in this task, in fact, the task that I'm modeling is Nathan's work, where they try to get people to reach an optimal threshold, right? But almost everyone starts high, and then it's higher, and then they reduce lower, at least in this context. But I think it is a good question to ask. I want to stress particularly that I'm not making any particular claims about how things actually vary, but I'm just sort of trying to show how this framework allows you to put in whatever theoretical constraints you think are reasonable. And we're starting with constraints here that threshold decreases, and that, as we'll see later, that drift rate increases. And this is definitely, I think, applicable to the task that we have here. I mean, if maybe.
And what is that?
I'll get to that in a second. Yep. But the point here is that you can, I guess, whatever function you want, or you think that your parameters might theoretically be conforming to, you could model parameters in that way, if that makes sense. Right, so in this, we're focusing on both A and B, because I think that it's a good starting point, and I think that particularly in the tasks that we're modeling here, and in many, many different tasks, even tasks that aren't learning tasks per se, which this one is, they could feasibly vary in some systematic way. So I probably should have talked about the task before I talked about the functions, which I might do. I might just skip ahead really quick. So we're using pre-existing data from Evans et al. 2017, and this is just a random kinetogram task where they had 24 blocks of 40 trials, and after the fourth blocks, participants received detailed feedback about how they're trading off speed and accuracy and how to make it more optimal. So this task was specifically about trying to get people to an optimal threshold. And you can see here that the response times are quite variable and generally a bit faster at the beginning, and then they receive this feedback, and it sort of just constrains a lot more and gets a lot faster.
Do people understand what 12.942% faster.
I don't think so. It's not my experiment, but they do find that this big chunk of feedback
Okay,
does improve people, get people to optimal much more than
great.
no feedback or just like a little bit. But yeah, I don't think that they would interpret that. But I think that they could interpret that you're going like a little bit faster than if you went a little bit faster than you would do better. All right, I think it's important for me to give this context for the task first before I describe the models, because that might make a bit more sense.
Is just another point about the RDK, is
Yeah.
there one coherence and they're just saying left or right, or is there multiple response
I
directions?
believe it's just left or right.
And okay, so there's not really variation in the difficulty of the RDK.
No, so
we're doing a repetitive task at one coherence.
Yeah.
Okay.
there are some other manipulations that they do and other conditions, but we're just sort of focusing on this one condition.
Okay.
Like different sort of speed accuracy trade-off that they emphasize. All right, I'll go back to the to the functions now with the context of the task that we're modeling here. So we've got a bunch of the first thing that we did here in terms of is looked at trial level functions. So this is completely ignoring any differences that might be systematically against blocks, but for example, just trying to see whether people might vary systematically in a particular way as a function of the trial that they're on. And so the simplest function to start with, even though I don't think it's the most theoretically relevant here, would just be a linear function. So it's the simplest trial level function in terms of the number of parameters, apart from, of course, the standard DDM. And as I mentioned before, we're assuming that V increases and A increases. The next is power functions. And as I mentioned earlier, power functions were sort of the first functions that people attributed to these RT effects in practice. So I think there's good theoretical reason to include these sorts of functions. And also, this is what the functions they tend to use in order to constrain trial dynamics in the reinforcement learning and diffusion model hybrids. We also have exponential functions, which look really similar to power functions, but have slight differences in the curve. Again, these relate to the practice effects that have been found as well with RTs. And we also have these transition functions. And so transition functions are a little bit different to exponential and power functions, although you have exponential power functions and exponential transition functions. But the basic thing here is that it assumes that there's some sort of initial period of slow learning before an optimal strategy is found. So you kind of get kind of this flattening for the curve and then the asymptote again.
Sorry, one other question.
Yeah.
How much can these functions approximate a step function?
Like
could you get like by changing the parameters of the power function? I forget whether it's been worked or not, but can you get like rapid decrease and then pretty much flat asymptote?
Like just
like not a smooth curve.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a good point actually, just to test like something that just did that, right? Like
yeah, like you don't
like
you don't understand the
asymptote
task very much.
Yeah,
then you understand the task, and then
power
function
like
or exponential is going to
like,
assume there's a smooth
curve
there, but that could be an artifact.
I don't know. I think that's a good point. I think that's particularly in this task, right, where they literally get told this feedback, and then the next block they like they have more. Actually, I'm gonna write that down. So I think that's a good point. I will say that we do have, I guess, like we do model the functions that just let blocks that let you estimate a different value in each block, so that they're super flexible and they would allow you to sort of just be like, all right, constant, and then like dramatic drop to like different parameter. And those do pretty well, but still not better than most of the, and I think that would get closest to that intuition. But then again, they're quite flexible, so they might get penalized quite a bit.
Yeah, so the reason I mentioned is because back when Estes was looking at learning curves, he showed that if you have a mixture of individuals that are all performing with a step function, that'll mimic a power law, speed up in the aggregate.
Yeah, I think that's a good important thing to look at. So yeah, then we've got these transition functions. So that's all of the sort of functions that we looked at the trial level. We also had a few block level functions as well. So it's possible that people might exhibit systematic changes in parameters that correspond with the blocks of the trial. These models were a little bit more basic, and we're still fleshing a lot of these out and very much in the development stage. But basically just corresponds to the idea that there might, most of the differences across time could just be related to differences across blocks. So we've got three general types of models here. We've got this complex block, which is just estimating a different block in each trial. It's not really a function per se. It's just, you just estimate a different value of the parameter each trial, like what I showed has been done previously. This is this sort of step block, which is not what you talked about, Dan, but it's a really simple way to just, you estimate it, you assume that it decreases by the same amount each trial. And so you estimate a parameter, which is that decrease, and then there's a different value. So it's much more simple, I guess, than the complex block one. And then we have these trial and learning functions, which is sort of a hybrid of the trial by trial functions and the by block functions, which assumes that, okay, so say you've got sort of this general exponential increase or decrease, but after each block, after you've had a break, there's some sort of trial on learning that happens where you sort of drop back down and then keep increasing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we still need to flesh a lot of them out, and they also do pretty badly from what we can see, but I think it's interesting to think about that these sorts of processes might be happening as well. All right, we already talked about this before. We're fitting it to this data, but like for the proper experiment or proper study, we want to fit it to many, many more data sets and sort of think about that more deeply about what we want to do. And of course, in this one, the parameters should definitely change across time because that's kind of the point of the experiment. So we're giving it the best chance to succeed here, I suppose. Not that this is really about succeeding or not succeeding per se, it's just because of course it's always going to depend on what paradigm you have. It's just sort of like showing that you could apply these sorts of models to these sorts of data and pick up on these effects. All right, so first reset question was, is allowing at least one parameter to vary better than the standard diffusion decision model? So for all of those functions that I showed you, we applied, for example, we let for each, we ran each of the trial varying and block varying models to each parameter, where only that parameter was allowed to vary according to that function, right? So for the linear function, we would have a linear function and a v linear function. And so for the a linear function, a was assumed to follow a linear function, but v was just the standard constant, right? So you're only assuming that one parameter varies across trials, but the other is held constant. So this was sort of the first round of models that we ran just to see if like, okay, it's just letting one of them vary better than just the standard DDM. And we just did sort of model comparison. I wish I had better plots to show you and made it look cooler, but I was doing this last night. So this is what we've got so far. So I'll walk you through it. Basically, we've got each participant here. There were 9 participants, and this is just the model rank. This is the top 10. There were 19 models in total. So you can see, for example, for the first participant, the sort of blocked model of A was the best model, where for the second participant, sort of exponential A model was the best. In terms of our research question, the simple model does quite poorly, right? So the best it does is 10th, and that's just for one participant. Usually it's a lot better. So it seems like the models that make this assumption about, oh, and this is BIC as well as what we use as well. So it penalizes complexity pretty heavily, at least relative to some other things. And so the simple model seems to be doing relatively poorly in this task compared to these other models.
I guess a few other things for future that I'd probably want to see are, how much is the best model winning by?
Yeah, so
what does it actually fit the data?
Yeah.
Because these models could be great, but still miss the data totally.
So this is good question, and I talk about this a little bit later. But so I have these plots that I do where you kind of compare the relative probability. So you turn BICs into BIC weights, and you use that to compare sort of the relative probability between models. And I didn't have time to do it for all the comparison I wanted to do, but I did do it for this. And basically it's like, so it was comparing the best time varying model against the simple model. And it's like 99% probable that the time varying model is better than the simple model.
And then I guess then the question would be, does the time varying model actually show the qualitative?
Does it actually fit?
effects?
Yeah. And so when we look at CDF plots, it does quite well. And I've got like one CDF, like one of the time varying models, I've got a CDF plot for at the end. But again, CDF plots don't really work here because they don't show time varying properties, right? So I think that they kind of underestimate the fit, like the benefit of the fit for the time varying models.
Yeah,
At
I
least
guess,
if
I
they
guess you could
were.
probably just would show the mean RT as a function.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
for quantile.
yeah. And so I wish I had those bits to show you, but I'm still sort of developing and working those. And so that's the caveat, right? Is that model comparison looks good, but of course, as Dan says, fits we still need to do some work on. We're still thinking about the best way to show it. They do, for what it's worth, they do well in the CDF plots, which I think is like the bare minimum requirement. But I think that we need to think about a better way to show across trials, like how to fit.
Yeah, so I've done a bit of work exploring systematic changes in parameters with functions, and one of the ways I did, the best way I could think of was just to divide things up into blocks, and because you could still look at the RT distribution within blocks of trials. So even though you're not fitting it kind of in a blockwise way, something like that is something you could do.
Just to visualize the fit.
Just to see what it's getting. Yeah.
So I'm just writing this down because it's all this stuff.
But you can technically just also assign individual parameters to blocks. It doesn't do well, but it's kind of essentially a non-parametric approach, which if there are any kind of limitations in the underlying functions, you could do better with a model like that.
That's what the block.
Sorry. Yeah.
So that's completely unconstrained. Like it just literally takes ages to run, but it's literally
It should have a higher penalty though, right?
Yeah, it does. And so that's the thing it fits really well. I mean, it depends how much you care, as always, right? It depends how much you care about the fit, but it fits great as it would, because it can fit but anything. But and with AIC it does much better, right? But BIC,
I guess one of the interesting things there though would be is it just doing something systematic you're not capturing? Is it fluctuating in some way, which the functions you have can't really do?
Well, that's what I would argue, right? And so I think I'm not so So that's the point of this is that the point of this is that this is supposed to be more theoretical in a sense, is that like, yes, the block model can fluctuate and show you, but the point of this project is like, okay, I have a hypothesis for how these parameters should change across time, and then sort of make a model to sort of show that. And so like, that's the thing with the block model, is it's like, it could just be random fluctuations across blocks. There's not any sort of theoretical, you haven't made any sort of theoretical prediction about how it's gonna change, and so people already do this, right, the block model, and I think particularly with this, because of the nature of how they've got 4 blocks just doing their thing, and then they get this feedback in the 4th block, that this complex model is going to do even better, because as you say, like there's just going to be this step down, right? Where
Maybe,
well, potentially, but there's a good chance that there's just going to be this step down, which the complex model is going to like capture very well. Whereas if it was sort of a more subtle change across times or a more gradual change across times, I don't think that this complex.
I think what I'm asking is it just capturing where the block model does well? Is it just capturing random variation, or is it capturing a systematic variation that's not represented in your function set?
I think that's a good question, and I think I would need to look at like the individual level data of that person to see what it looked like. Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting to see sort of like the delayed exponential model being the next level best model, and it's also, I haven't seen how much better this block model is, and I think that's an important question to ask, but I just haven't looked at it yet. Because there could be some other function that would do better that we just haven't encountered. All right, how are we going for time? Okay. So the second research question we had was, does it look like multiple parameters seem to vary or just one? So remembering that the point of this experiment was to manipulate thresholds. They were making particular emphasis about the speed accuracy trade-off. So it would be kind of interesting if we found here that it wasn't just threshold that was varying across trials. So what we did here, obviously, you end up having a lot of models, right? So you can't test every single combination. So we just took the best performing A models and the best performing B models for each participant and then combined them. So, you know, you would have a model where you would have the exponential A model, for the exponential model for A and also the exponential model for B, and you would both sort of put them into and let it do its thing. I will note that this A block complex and the linear model I don't have for because it took so long to fit, and then I realized after I fit it like yesterday that the BIC didn't say properly, but I don't think that it would do that. It didn't seem to be doing that well on the single parameter models anyway, so I think still good to look at, but I'm not too concerned. All right, again, sorry, I don't have better fits. And again, I'd rather do something where I can actually assess like, okay, how much better did things do? But it does seem like for the vast majority of participants that there's two processes going on. So there's only two participants that are best fit by models that assume one parameter varies, and most participants are best fit by this model that assume both A and B vary across trials, which I have to think about more about what this actually means, but I think it is interesting, particularly given in this experiment, they were supposed to be only targeting the speed accuracy trade-off.
Can you approach this question in a different way and think about both V and A as being generated by a bivariate distribution with some covariance which changes across trials, and so there you've got your function is applied at essentially the correlation between the parameters across trials, and then I guess once you've got kind of a general model which can fit, you know, basically lots of different relationships between the two parameters, then look at it and see whether, you know, oh, you could constrain this even further by applying like a double exponential or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that, and I'm not sure that
it just seems like
how I would implement that, but that sounds like a good idea.
It just seems like combining the two best fitting models is going to miss some relationship between the parameters.
Yeah,
but I take
interested to hear your thoughts more about this. This is pretty crude, right? Like it's just like this is the bit, and like there might be some sort of combination that works better than both, and I think that
I'm not sure whether that would work in like a Gaussian process sense. You've got a function of two parameters. Fit some aspect of it.
Yeah, if you do, like, I would be very interested to know how. I think that I'd probably goes over my head at this point, but yeah, we do need to think about better ways to sort of justify which double parameter models we're including, and there would be better ways. We've just sort of done the sort of thing here. All right, so yeah, I guess the basic conclusion is that in this study there seems to be two sort of things going on, and I guess the general point is that these models seem to be able to capture sort of these double processes happening. The third thing we looked at, are these trial functions better than just assuming that they change at the block level? So we've touched on that slightly. The A block, there was only one participant that best fit the model that allows different estimates in each block. So we talked about this before, so these include, I think Dan raised a pretty good point about this, but I think that it suggests that there is some sort of theoretical change across time that the models are picking up on, right? And it's not just sort of random fluctuation that we can't predict. I don't know if I described that right, but we've sort of already discussed this. There is one participant that's best fit by a model that assumed a decline at a constant rate after each block. So that was a sort of like simple step block thing. But that was also combined with the linear decrease in V. Again, I think I don't want to draw too many inferences about what this means for each individual participant, because again, this is just one data set and there's a lot more inquiry I think we need to do about these models and how well they can actually sort of describe the functions that they say they describe, as I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think the overall point here is that it's these trial level functions are doing a lot better than the block level functions are. All right. Fourth thing. So sorry, that's so tiny. Anyway, it's the time varying processes affect the measurement properties of the standard diffusion model. So a little bit of a sort of switch here is that you could assume that with these models, we can also generate data that we would assume that comes out of these models, right? So time varying data. And so, for example, if I generated data with a model that assumes that A varies exponentially, and I could try to recover those parameters using the standard diffusion model, where A basically corresponds to the asymptote. And I think that maybe is what you were talking about earlier, Dan, about you're more interested in asymptote rather than like you're more interested in the asymptote because you need to just sort of cut off the first 40 trials or whatever. And so we can test this using recovery where we generate data using the sort of exponential A model, and then we try to recover the asymptote parameters with just the A parameter of the standard diffusion model. I'm not sure if that's a very good explanation, but basically we could think that two things could potentially happen, right? It could correctly estimate the asymptote because that's actually what people's states are for the majority of the experiment, or it could feasibly sort of overestimate the asymptote as well because of this extra this bump at the start. But what we found is that the diffusion model does seem to do quite well. I think there's still a lot to do here that we haven't done it on. We've only done it on one model, but the early signs do look good for the diffusion model for being able to fit the data generated from a time varying model. So at least the conclusion here isn't like, okay, so if your data was sort of changing, if somebody was actually their A parameter was varying in like a power function, an exponential function, it wouldn't completely mess up your diffusion model parameters.
So you don't have any variability parameters, is that right?
Yeah, so that's another, yeah. This is just.
Do you have bias?
Bias is just 0.5. It's not estimated, so it's just
Why not estimate bias as well?
We could. I guess we're just trying to constrain it as much as possible to start with, but
yeah, because I mean, I understand accessing the variability parameters, but bias seems like a pretty reasonable thing.
Yeah.
That could also vary across the experiment as well.
Yeah. Well, I think I had it on the slide, but I didn't talk about it. So I think that these models can and definitely should be applied to bias too, right? And that's sort of the point, is that these general models could be applied to bias as well. I think you're talking more about why didn't you estimate bias, not just make it 0.5, which I think is a good point. And I think it'd be pretty easy to just rerun it with bias and see what happens. And I think we should do that.
So what sort of model was used to generate this again? Did you say that on the previous slide?
It's the exponential, so the A exponential.
And what was the shape of the exponential? Did it just drop off very quickly? So there's actually not a lot of RTs. So most of it is at the asymptote, which is
exactly
maybe why this is
recovering
so well.
Well, you say watch slope, so it was estimated with a bunch of different. So this is like, so this is like a full recovery. So this is estimated with like a bunch of different parameters and a bunch of different slopes, right? So you can see that it's got like this. So you can't see, but the generating parameters were, you had generating parameters of like of rate and start, and all of the exponential parameters and all of the sort of combinations of exponential parameters. And so, and it seems like, you could say that, you could argue that like certain combinations of rate and asymptote, maybe rate and start or whatever, asymptote might not be as well recoverable, but it seems like for all of the combinations, it is pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that would seem to me cause the most trouble is if we had a very general, very gradual decrease in asymptote over time.
Yeah.
But if you have a steep decrease, then there's not a lot of data that's being generated at those kind of larger asymptote or larger.
And that makes sense to me, and I'm not sure. I'll have to look at this more because that makes sense, right? But given the way that this recovery was sampled, I thought it would have accounted for that.
Yeah, it looks pretty good.
But that makes sense. Like it's the only time I could imagine asymptote being able to be recovered is if is if there's a lot of trials. Did you have something?
Oh no, I think you covered it.
Well, that kind of adds on to the next sort of part where, well, what are the measurement properties of the models in this actual study? I haven't done a full recovery of the models, but I have just for the single A exponential and the B exponential models respectively. And as sort of we alluded to in the last, but just on the last slide, the asymptote parameter recovers quite well, but the others don't. And the reason why is because you have way more trials to estimate asymptote over usually. So there might be some sort of constraint on the values of start and rate that I've inadvertently put in that has meant that there's always a lot of asymptote trials. So I'll have to have a look at that.
Sorry,
Yeah.
why are there less trials that you can recover the rate from? I'm not sure if that's.
Well, because maybe I'm describing this wrong, but rate is just sort of, rate is estimated based on sort of the curve from the start to the asymptote. And because it reaches the asymptote quite early,
Yeah.
it
Okay.
maintains sort of a constant rate for a really
Yeah,
long
yeah.
trial. So like
Okay,
a change happens in like the first, 100 trials or something, and then there's like
No, that doesn't make
700
sense.
trials. But
The rate also looks like it's not, it's wrong in a specific way.
well, yeah, so I looked at that. So you're talking about like the bottom,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is that just like a linear function when the rate is 0?
So I looked at that more specifically by constraining the rate to between 0 and 0.10. And actually, I think I've inadvertently put the V version of that on the right-hand side. If you look at the scales, they're different. But when you kind of zoom in on that, it's just noise. There's no linear. So I thought, oh, maybe it's recoverable in earlier rates, but it doesn't seem to be the case. But I think the point is here is that, well, it doesn't, it's important to say, but this isn't obviously supposed to be a measurement model, right? So I haven't done full recoveries on all of the models, but I think that we're going to see a lot of the same, right? You couldn't use this model to be like, okay, I want to see what people's learning rate is using like an exponential function. You couldn't do that because it's just not recoverable.
You should be able to get a decent recovery, I think, with a linear function.
Yeah.
So having done that,
yeah.
you can usually do pretty well.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at that, but like that one's much simpler. So that'll be interesting to see that one as well. But again, I think that's not really, have to be clear that these aren't models for these parameters aren't for estimation. I think that these are generally going to do better. These kinds of models are generally going to do better as a theoretical model comparison sense. I'm going to talk about it here, but it would be nice to do a model recovery rather than sort of a parameter recovery to make sure that if you generate a certain response time and accuracy distribution with a certain model, that model wins again, right? So we want to make sure that you can actually distinguish, for example, between a power and an exponential model, because I think that's important for the claims that you would make, or for why you would use this sort of framework anyway. So I just mentioned that about they probably don't have very good measurement properties, although you could probably do it for asymptote. So if you were interested in just measuring asymptote, you could do that because that seems pretty well recoverable. But again, the standard diffusion model does a pretty good job of recovering that, but we only know that for A, so I haven't just tested that for the other parameters as well. This paradigm specifically was designed to sort of make people change their threshold. So we're seeing these models do quite well, but I'm really interested about more standard paradigms that aren't sort of explicitly about learning, because as I sort of alluded to at the start, I think that you would see trial level learning in almost any experiment in some form. My intuition is that generally thresholds would decrease and generally drift rates would increase, but of course it really depends on what task you have. But I'm interested in applying this to like a task that's not explicitly about learning, where people aren't actually considering learning and seeing, well, okay, well, you are seeing sort of systematic changes in these parameters over time, even though you're not trying to do that.
But this one's not explicitly about learning.
We're not about, well,
I mean, because it's
about
a decision,
practice.
you
Not
will
about
get
learning,
practice effects.
yeah, I should specify it's about practice, and there's only one point of feedback, right? So it's definitely not a reinforcement learning paradigm.
Oh, right, so you don't get told trial by trial.
Not trial by
Okay.
trial. It's literally just after that block.
Gotcha.
You're like, okay, this is how you're doing. Like, this is what you do.
I mean,
that's as far as I understand it.
One of the things that's going to constrain the generalizability of this is that the diffusion models, it assumes a specific architecture. So if you're getting kind of really drastic changes in strategy, like of the sort that you would see in categorization, for instance, or perceptual learning,
Right.
where you might get the emergence of holistic processing or the breakdown of holistic processing, depending on the trial structure and what you're being shown, then that's going to be picked up by, changes in drift rate or
Right.
changes in asymptote, but that's not, it's not a really good description of what's going on.
Okay. Yeah.
I think you're kind of limited in the inferences you can make to those specific mechanisms. Whereas, you might be seeing just a wholesale change in the tensions being focused here, and then it becomes broader, and that's related to drift rate, but it's not fully captured by drift rate.
Would it be captured by, I suppose in those contexts, you want to have a model that does capture those things specifically?
Yeah. I mean, I've thought about this in the context of perceptual learning, where you get kind of a shift from serial processing to something more parallel, or a breakdown of parallel processing, something more serial, which you can't capture with a single architecture model like the Diffusion model.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I hope it's, I'm sure it's clear from this talk that there's a lot that needs to be done here in terms of testing what we can actually do with these models, right? And I think with any kind of theoretical framework, you obviously need to think about, if you're applying this to your paradigm, what does this actually mean? So this isn't just a catch-all, all right, you want to know if your parameters are varying, apply this, but
I think it's good evidence that the parameters aren't properly.
Yeah. And so the context, I mean, for what it's worth, the reason why I thought about this is because the stuff I'm doing with Andy and Keith, I'm doing sort of social learning. And so I was interested, okay, how would diffusion model parameters change across time as you sort of learn to trust someone, or learn to, you might sort of see systematic shifts in information processing, or how cautious you are, or how much evidence you need to accumulate. And so, I'm interested in sort of applying this model, which is why I can say that this is part of my PhD, even though it's very different to the stuff. Apply this to these sorts of learning paradigms and sort of try to get see if those things change across trials. But
I just kind of want to add on to Dan's point. Even if there aren't strategy shifts, there could be some other kind of dynamic theoretical model that might be producing changes in both drift and or not necessarily changes in drift, but changes in threshold that could result in a lot of different functions that would result. Doug Vickers actually has a really interesting model where I can't remember the name of it, but so he has this accumulator model that produces confidence based on the balance of evidence. And the way it produces these dynamic properties is that the predicted confidence is the model's always trying to keep confidence constant across trials. So it produces changes in thresholds of both accumulators in order to attempt to maintain that. So you get these kind of dynamic changes in threshold across trials, which can also be responsive to changes in drift rate as well. So because if drift rate changes in some way, then it still has to kind of make these threshold adjustments in response to that. So it will kind of tightly couple those two things. But I'm not really sure what specific function it might follow. You could even get nonlinear functions depending on the nature of the trial structure and things like that.
So are you saying that there's some sort of codependence that you might not be, that these models will be able to?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so and also it could be driven by something like a third variable, for example, confidence, which to me relates more to threshold, but isn't threshold, right? It's theoretically something.
Yeah. And you produce changes in bias as well. So it's an accumulator model. So you get, bias comes out of the thresholds. But yeah, it'd be you could potentially, I don't know if anybody's actually ever fit that model because it's probably a pain, but you could generate data from it and fit it with some of your models, and you probably see all kinds of weird stuff happening.
I don't know if you remember the name of that.
Yeah, I could look into it. But yeah.